Hello everybody, it's the Alco Diesel Guy, or should I say hola mi amigos, as this video begins with some footage from the Grand Fiesta Tour located in Epcot in Walt Disney World. And that's where the whole segue comes in, as I usually like to use these. Many of the people who know me personally know that I am a hardcore Disney freak slash Universal Studios freak. I just love the theme parks. And unfortunately, thanks to a very unfortunate and very well-known health crisis, I was unable to get down there this year. It's unfortunate, but well, that's just how things happened. And now you're probably wondering what this has to do with HO scale trains. I happened to be browsing eBay a while back, and I actually found that, in fact, there was a Toy Story 2 themed train set. Needless to say, this is shocking in two ways. A, the fact that it exists, and B, the fact that I don't have it. So needless to say, I figured since I can't go to Disney, I can at least go to infinity and beyond with this particular themed train set. And here it is. And before you ask, is this park merchandise? Actually, no. Apparently, this particular train set was sold of all places in Toys R Us and a few other locations. Another interesting fact is that this set is not made by Bachmann. It's made by a company called IHC. And particularly if you're a European viewer to my channel, the model railroad company IHC probably doesn't roll off your tongue, nor does it probably even register. That said, if I were to use the name Mihano, well, that name would probably really grab your attention and definitely register, particularly as of late, as the company seems to have made a bit of a comeback, and several of my fellow YouTubers have discovered their new train sets, which seem to pack quite a bit of bang for the buck. Although not all of them are top quality, they definitely do the job better than some other manufacturers, which I shall not mention. Unfortunately for those of us who live in the US, IHC shut down about 2014 or so. And because Model Power is also now kaput, this basically means that there is no US distributor or any way or mechanism, that is to say, of getting Mihano products into the US currently, and or at least officially sanctioned by Mihano itself. Taking a good look at the box, we can see that this is the real deal, not some 2-bit knockoff. I must also point out that even though I stated before that this was not park merchandise, this is not to say there was no chance this was ever sold in the parks themselves. If we take a good close initial look at the box, we see the set is propelled by an Alco locomotive, which needless to say is not my least favorite locomotive, to put it mildly. We also see Buzz Lightyear and Woody very clearly represented in the corner here, and we also note that the disclaimer on the top here says ages 8 and older. The reason being for this is that this set came out roughly 20 years ago, long before the new regulations that pushed the age all the way up to 14, and that's the age I would recommend considering if you're buying this for someone younger. Make sure they're at least 14 years and up, as per the new regulations. We also note that what's left of a Toys R Us sticker right there in the corner on the right. It's kind of hard to spot, but that's apparently my indication that this was in fact sold in Toys R Us, although I'm sure they were sold in other Toy Story stores as well. Taking a closer look at the box, we get a good glimpse of the equipment included, including the prominent Woody Roundup car, the green Martian tank car thing. Below it we have Emperor Zurd, of course, and Buzz Lightyear. And the final box car features the iconic scene with the construction cones from the movie, which is one of the better parts in my opinion. There's a red caboose with both Buzz Lightyear and Woody on it. Turning over to the side of the box, we get a description of the contents inside. The authentically detailed C430 8-wheel drive Alco locomotive, which is of course one of the other things that lured me to this set. It again describes the 5 collectors' cars, as well as the massive loop this particular set has on it, which I'll get into more later on. The back shows more movie art, really nicely done. Again, Buzz Lightyear, Bo Peep, the Piggy Bank, Mr. Potato Head and Mrs. Potato Head, Slinky, the Prospector guy, I can't remember exactly who he was, the Rex. All the characters, they're very well represented and very nicely put on there. We also note on the bottom again, and made in Slovenia, very clearly indicating that this is in fact a Mihano product, printed in Italy, interestingly enough. And finally, International Hobby Corporation's production section is noted there, and of course the iconic IHC logo for those of you familiar with IHC. Well, that about does it for the outside of the box. Let's open her up and see what this set really has to offer. I should also take this opportunity to note that this set was listed on eBay as new, although it was taped shut when I received it. We immediately note the usual Mihano-style packing, although it's usually in baby diarrhea brown as of late from what I've seen from previous videos from my other fellow YouTubers. Here in this case, it's fern white, and again in 2 pieces. Although I initially thought the plastic had failed due to age, which is common in these older train sets when they've been stored for so long.
Because it's supposed to be like that.
Take a look at the set in detail. We'll start off with the locomotive itself. Again, according to the box, this is in fact a C430 with 8-wheel drive, one of Mihano's standard models they've made for quite some years. This is marketed under Model Power as well for a period of time. Again, Mihano's distribution rights in the US were kinda all over the place, with several different manufacturers sharing in the rights to sell certain engines at certain times. The paint on the locomotive is pretty striking, I have to say, although it is kind of cheaper plastic. We note that it does in fact have nickel-silver wheels, and again it's all-wheel drive. I'll go more into the drivetrain a little bit later on. Detailing is kind of crude, but that's typical Mihano for you. Over here we have the first boxcar, again Woody's Roundup, very nicely painted with the iconic Woody and his sidekick, I forgot her name, and I think that his trigger is Horse. Unlike all of the rest of the rolling stock in this set, it again has plastic wheels and plastic horn hook couplers. Again, we need to remember the era in which this train set was produced. And we have that tank car thing with the Martians on it. I believe these Martians came from the Pizza Palace. They were prizes in a crane game at that particular food establishment. Next we have the Buzz Lightyear versus Emperor Zurd boxcar. Again, very well painted on there, very nicely done. And once again with plastic wheels and horn hook couplers. Next we have the iconic construction cone scene from the film. Again, please watch this film if you haven't. This is one of the best parts in my opinion. Very well reproduced. All of this has been painted very nicely. But again, it's the standard Mihano stock from this era. Horn hook couplers and plastic wheels, and again, plastic horn hook couplers, to make it very clear. And of course, we have the final, last but not least, the caboose. Of course, it's going to be red. That's almost obligatory, it seems, these days. Woody and Buzz, very nicely painted on there. But again, it's standard IHC rolling stock with, again, plastic wheels and plastic horn hook couplers. That about does it for the rolling stock. Let's see what else this train set has to offer. As we can see, we have a little parts bag there on the left that actually contains a few extra spare parts, including some extra joiners. I'll go into that in more detail in a second. But we also have a pretty big blast from the past, especially for you Tyco collectors out there. Yes, this is in fact the Tyco Transformers from sort of their latter era. The reason being is IHC bought out a lot of Tyco's old stock and or the designs to build these things. As you notice now, it distinctly says Mihano. These are no longer in production. They've been replaced by a different Transformer. We also note the tracks and the instructions. The tracks themselves aren't anything too exciting. They're not road-bedded or anything. They're just good old-fashioned steel alloy tracks. But look at the enormity and how much you get here. And it's not surprising if you take a look at the box. It actually comes with, and this is something I can't get past, a massive 6 by 3 foot oval loop. Put that in perspective, the Bachmann General train set that I recently reviewed actually only had 4 straight sections, making the loop of track included with this train set twice the size of that of the Bachmanns. So, yes, while this is a cheap steel alloy type track that's already starting to corrode in many places, you do get plenty of bang for your buck, and you have to give Mihano credit for that. Especially when you consider that this train set retailed for under $100 from back in the day, as best I can tell. Taking a close look at the curves, we see that they are, again, the usual 18-inch turns. Pretty sharp. I think this comes down to what I believe is a first radius curve. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but these are super tight tracks. There is one radius shorter than that called 15 inches, but not commonly used. Over here, again, we have that little parts bag. We have the wires to hook the transformer up. We also have some track lock assemblies, which Mihano seems famous for. They're still using them to this day, which I'm surprised. And of course, some extra rail ties for the tracks themselves, or rail joiners, depending upon how you refer to them as, or fish plates, just in case they fail, which, as we all know, they will eventually fail, especially if the track is not tied down. The derailleur itself will probably come off as looking strangely familiar to you Tyco collectors out there, as yet again this is an old production Tyco part that essentially Mihano took over after the company went bust. Mihano then moved production over to Slovenia and continued to produce them for the US market. We also have the usual literature, again instructions of how to put the track together and how to safely hook up the transformer, as well as the warranty information, etc, etc, etc. Now normally at this point in my review I would start setting up the tracks, hooking up the transformer, and showing you how to do it right and everything else. But I'm not going to do that for a few reasons. The first is, well, that gets kind of tedious after a while. How many times can you show someone how to put tracks together? The second is that I actually want to run this train set on my main layout, I've decided. So in order to do that I need to do one important thing, and that is to convert it over to DCC, which is what I'm going to get started with right now. Also a great opportunity to take a look at the drive system on the locomotive itself. The first step is to remove 2 screws underneath the cab of the locomotive itself. Once we've removed the 2 screws from underneath the cab, we then have to remove 2 screws from the fuel tank. With the screws from the fuel tank removed, we can then carefully lift the shell off. Please note there is an extra tab on the back of the locomotive that is rather stubborn. Don't force it, as it can break and make it very difficult, if not impossible, to properly reattach the shell. My advice is to use a screwdriver and gently work it free. Under the hood, we can see very clearly that Mihano hasn't stood still and has continued to evolve its drivetrains. As we can see in the split-screen comparison with this Mihano RS2 from the Blue Eagle set I reviewed earlier, we now have a 5-pole motor replacing the infamous 3-poler that was in this particular locomotive. And while the drive shafts are new, it still lacks flywheels, which will mean this locomotive will stop and start very abruptly. As we'll see, the new motor placed in this particular train set locomotive would prove to be much more effective and smoother running, especially at lower speeds, than the one in the older Blue Eagle train set I reviewed earlier. I would also like to note at this point, although you can't see it, this locomotive utilizes wheel wipers for power pickup from the trucks. And I should also note that wheel wipers are par for the course for Mihano, as all of their engines use them for pickup. With the show off the locomotive, I can now begin to show you how to install the DCC decoder, or at least I could have if this didn't happen. As we can see, the footage I shot from this point on is all corrupted and therefore completely unusable, so I'm going to have to reconstruct it using a few photos, although the concept is still pretty simple. We'll be using a DASR type decoder built by NCE, board or motherboard style decoder as they're beginning to be referred to as. It's a very basic decoder with no fancy resistors or anything crazy like that. It's essentially the closest thing you can get to for a drop-in decoder install for something like this. And as you've seen, I've employed the model railroader's secret weapon, or the locomotive kit basher's secret weapon, double-sided tape to secure it into place right on top of the motor. The advantage of using this tape, in addition to the fact that it makes a killer adhesive, is the fact that it will also act as an insulator from the metal motor to the decoder itself. Essentially, I'm killing two birds with one stone by using this. Next, we have to make a series of cuts to rewire the electrical system for it to work with DCC. For most basic power systems, the power is flowing directly to the motor with 4 connections, 2 on each truck, 1 positive and 1 negative per truck. Essentially, you need to send the power to the decoder itself, and then hook the motor up to the decoder so it can be commanded by the decoder. The first cut we're going to make is to the blue wires, as these are actually a slightly thicker gauge than the black wires to the side there. The cut is indicated by the 2 black circles you see on those 2 wires. We'll take the section that is still connected to the motor itself and hook them directly into the motor drive connection on the decoder as signified by the red circles. The remaining section will be connected to the power input points located at the back of the decoder as signified by the green circles on the screen. And that actually brings us to the halfway point. Next, we'll deal with the wires in the front, which are of a thinner gauge for some strange reason. Again, we're going to cut the wire at the 2 black circles and connect them to the 2 green circles, which is the front power input of the DASR decoder. I recommend cutting the black wires as close to the motor as possible, as there is no need for another connection to the motor at this point, and the excess wire will serve no other purpose than to jam the motor or the shaft. Also, be sure to insulate the ends of the wire so you don't get a crossed wire which can destroy the decoder. A word of advice and or a critical tip, please make sure your wires go straight off the truck and right to the connecting points. Do not cross them, as this can lead to a short and will destroy your decoder. From this point, the video footage actually survived, albeit in a strange aspect ratio. As it turns out, my phone apparently rotated itself. Don't ask me what caused that to happen. Our next step is to deal with the incandescent bulb on the front. Again, the DASR is a basic decoder that lacks all resistors, and that's fine for an incandescent bulb. We don't want a resistor. It would mean something that would just need to get bridged, which is why I prefer this decoder for simple projects like this. Now, to deal with the incandescent bulb, we have to first disconnect it, as it is actually soldered to the front truck directly. It is not connected at any other point to the locomotive, although technically the motor is kind of bridging both connections, as both trucks are connected directly to the motor itself. So I think that's how the system was transferring power. Whatever the case, we have to change this now, as the decoder has to have control of the headlight for it to actually be able to, well, make it light via the DCC system. First, though, we need to get the truck off so we can access it. To do this, we're going to pop off this little sort of spring-loaded plastic piece, as I call it, with a flathead screwdriver. This is a bit of a tedious procedure to go through. It's similar to the worm gear covers you see me do on the more expensive Atlas and Atheron locomotives, but the fact of the matter is it's basically the same concept, except this one is actually designed to be a little bit more user-friendly, although I find it to be more of a pain to work with. With the clip removed, we can now drop the truck and get access to the wires we need to clip out. Again, we need to be very careful to ensure that we are cutting the right ones. There are 4 wires going down there, 2 of them for the incandescent bulb, and 2 of them are the actual pickups, which we have now soldered to the decoder. If we clip the input wires coming off the truck to the decoder, we will need to resolder them, so it's a good idea to be very careful and trace the wires down at this point. Please accept my apologies for the rough camera work at this point. I was running into some issues trying to get this to cooperate, and I actually stopped looking through the viewfinder. I was just trying to get it done without damaging anything. With the headlight wires to the truck now cut, we can now reinstall the truck like it was before. Again, line it up carefully and put the shaft in place. As you'll note in a later part of this footage, I forgot to put the shaft in place and I had to actually take it out again, so please ensure that you do line the shaft up with the motor before you put the clip in, as you see me do there. Yes, I know I'm a bonehead. With the headlight wire successfully detached from the truck, we strip the wire ends and twist them so they can be fed through the two headlight connections on the front of the board. Please note they are the inner connections, not the outer ones. Also note, for those of you not familiar working with incandescent bulbs, it does not matter which side goes into which plug, just as long as they're not touching each other. As, again, a light bulb just requires one positive input and one negative input. It doesn't matter which wire goes to which. Again, just make sure they don't touch each other or cross. With the wires in position, we'll use a micro brush to apply a little flux to help guide the solder in place. I prefer using this method because it ensures that the connection will stay nice and damp. I usually would tin the wire, but I found it works better this way just because of how tiny the hole I had to fit those wires through is, and also how delicate the wires are. With the flux successfully on the wires, I'll grab my soldering iron, tin, and then gently apply some solder to the two connection points we've set up. With this headlight connected, I then took the chassis over to my DCC system to test it, and found to my delight the decoder worked fine, all systems were go, except but for one minor problem. I hooked the motor up backwards, causing the headlight to only work when the locomotive was running in reverse, which is not going to work for me, to put it mildly. The fix for this, however, is extremely simple. Simply unsolder the wires and switch them around. Note, if this does happen to you, I recommend using a pair of pliers to keep the tension on the wires. And yes, I did see how those wires were making contact with that chip, which of course is a problem. I went ahead and trimmed the excess off with a pair of snips, as we can see, to correct the problem, so there would be no issues. Next, it was time to get ready to button everything up, as they say. That is to say, place the shell on top and make sure everything fit correctly. The first step was to tape back those excess wires that you see on the back there, the blue ones, to ensure they wouldn't become entangled in the drive system and jam it up. And yes, this is actually a factory technique used by Atlas, Bachmann, and other manufacturers to prevent this from happening on their models. With everything all taped up and safely stowed, it's time to see if we can get the shell on. This is a pretty tricky process, as the decoder will just barely be accommodated by the shell itself, so you need to be very careful that the decoder remains straight and flat as you press the shell down. Also ensure that no wires are going to get trapped and/or crushed by the shell as it goes into position, as if these wires get ripped apart, you're going to have to take everything apart again to fix them, and resolder them, bodge them, etc. So it's a good idea, in short, to take your time at this particular phase, as tempting as it is to rush to get the project done. With my locomotive on a soft piece of packing foam, we can now finish putting the shell in place. This includes reinstalling the weight that actually is hidden by the fuel tank on the base of the locomotive. Please note, once the weight's in place, you place the fuel tank on top. It will only go in one way. I found this out the hard way, as I spent about 10 minutes messing with this thing, only to find that I had the fuel tank rotated 180 degrees in the wrong direction. Turning it around allowed me to quickly and easily install it. With the fuel tank back in its proper location, we use the stock screws to secure it into place. With the fuel tank now secured to the body, we next reinstall the screws beneath the cab to hold the shell in place. And just like that, she's all finished and ready for her test run, so we can finally take a look and see how this train set performs. Before I give this locomotive a test, I just have to marvel on how nicely detailed this inexpensive truck is. All the brake shoes are in place, the springs are in place. It really looks realistic for such an inexpensive model. Point out is the fact that the box says the locomotive has a, quote, lit interior, not a headlight, and you can clearly see why. The locomotive is also not a great crawler, and I kind of expected as much with the lack of flywheels. Nonetheless, it's still very respectable with the low speeds it's able to reach. That's on speed step number 3. Although I did note that the unit again jammed when attempting to go backwards and had a tendency to surge and or stall even going forwards. Please note I did this crawl test after I had run the locomotive in for a while, so it was given a fair shot to perform as well as it could. Still, not bad, especially considering the price this locomotive sells for. I also note there are a few nice little details and touches added, including those 3 carb body vents in the center, and the lower air exhaust vent on the back of the unit right there. Without further ado, let's give her a whirl. As you can hear, despite all the noise on my layout with the sound-equipped locomotives, this is a very smooth-running engine, despite its inexpensive nature. It is a bit jerky, unfortunately, due to the lack of flywheels, but that's really my biggest complaint. It's also a bit on the sensitive side to power output. I'm thinking those wheel wipers, which unfortunately are utilized in the system, something I forgot to mention before, are probably a bit on the worn-out side, considering how long this engine's been sitting in its box. Now let's see how she does on Whitestone Mountain. As you can see, no problems whatsoever, although I didn't expect the 4-axle to have any issues. Note the engine's sudden stutter right there. That's the unusual quirk this engine seems to have with every weak point in the track. Not sure why it's so sensitive, other than that it seems to run perfectly. And once again, the locomotive just found a weak point in the track again, although I must note it did not stall, it just hesitated. And here's a strange quirk with this machine. For some reason, this locomotive does not like running in reverse. Remember what I said about those wires getting tangled in the drive system? I'm starting to think I didn't do a good enough job trimming them. Other than that, I really haven't found any faults with this locomotive's performance at all. Just this weird quirk where the engine will only back up so far before coming to a screeching halt and needing to go forward before it'll run again. Although I have had other Mihanos jam up like this. And now that we have taken a thorough look at the locomotive, let's see how it performs when connected to the rest of the set itself. But first, let's pan the set to see how it looks when it's all hooked up together. And away she goes. The freight cars in this set with their crude plastic wheels and crude horn hook couplers didn't inspire a lot of confidence, but actually didn't really have much in the way of derailments with the exception of that caboose. And now, as they say, let's pick up the tempo and see how this set handles a little more speed on the throttle. Cautiously, I might add. Did I mention my problems with that derailing caboose? As you can see, the fix was simple. I simply turned the caboose around and that solved the problem. I was actually surprised at just how much speed this train could handle without falling off the track. Now let's see how she handles the inner track with its S-curves and twists and turns. Not sure what happened with that silver Buzz Lightyear Emperor Zurd boxcar there. Whatever the case, it didn't seem to derail completely and it kept going. Now let's see how the locomotive handles Whitestone Mountain with all the cars in tow. A little wheel slip there, but nothing too bad. So the locomotive in this set isn't the greatest puller around, but that said, considering the price this set went for, it's still highly respectable. And yet again, another hesitation from the engine. Don't know why it does that. As far as I'm concerned, it's a combination of the lack of flywheels as well as the wheel wipers being used for pickup. I will also note that I did do some track cleaning as the set ran to try to give the engine the best chance of performing the smoothest, although the jerking persisted in some weird spots. I can't help but be highly impressed at just how well this inexpensive set handles the mountain run. No problems whatsoever, except for a little slippage coming up the mountain and one or two minor hesitations such as that point on the switch there. But other than that, pretty much flawless, especially when you consider just how inexpensive this set really is. Again, the set retailed for around $100 at new, and I think actually a little bit less than that. I think it was something like $85. I think I've seen similar sets from Mahano, and I'm assuming that's what this was set up to retail for, possibly a little bit more depending upon where you bought it. Still, this set is quite a bit of bang for your buck for what it was. And as this train set continues to circle my layout, it's now time for me to give my final opinion. This is really a nice set for what it was, especially considering the price it was set at. Unfortunately, it comes from another era, which is probably one of the reasons why the price was down. An era in which IHC or Mahano actually still imported train sets into the United States. The locomotive and cars are very nicely painted with the Toy Story theme, although they are standard Mahano cars. I particularly like that construction cone themed car from that iconic scene from the movie. A lot of nice little touches there. This is essentially the market that Bachmann used to serve. Their products weren't built to the highest quality and standards, but they weren't bad for what they were, and they were very affordable. Now Bachmann's products, in sharp contrast to this particular train set, seem to have gone drastically up in price and done very little to enhance the quality. Worse still, in some cases, they've taken a step back in quality, as several of my fellow YouTubers have noted reviewing train sets and locomotives from the company as of late. Bottom line, this is not a BMW, Rolls-Royce, or a Cadillac, comparing it favorably to a Atlas, Atheron, or perhaps a Broadway Limited locomotive. It's a Chevy, and there's nothing wrong with it being a Chevy, as long as it's sold for Chevy prices, which this unit was. This whole set came, again, to under $100 back in the day, or with a retail price of somewhere just over $100. And for that very minimal price, you get a lot for your money, including a 6-foot loop, and 4 very nicely done freight cars, although not the highest quality, and of course a caboose. Really, you can't beat the bang for the buck Mihano gives you in this set, and I would strongly recommend picking it up just based on that fact. Even if you're not a Toy Story 2 fan, if you are a Toy Story 2 or any other kind of Disney fan, and you are also a model railroader, well, you need to have the set. If you don't, what are you waiting for? Get out there and buy one. And again, before I close this review out, I'd like to give credit and thanks to HOSeeker.net. Again, a lot of my sources come from this site. If you're looking for info on HO scale models, check this website out. They have everything from parts lists to blueprints to old catalogs. Again, they don't sponsor me. I'm just giving credit where credit is due. And again, the archive is free, so feel free to check them out. And that's going to about do it for this review. If you liked it, thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please subscribe, as it does really help me a lot. And as always, keep the metal side down.